So hello everyone, my name is Christoph Lutroth from the Reveal Center, and it's my pleasure to share with you some tips how to write research papers. So I aim to keep it fairly general, so these tips you can use them for Chi papers, for other types of papers, for journal articles, or even for research reports and theses. So it's scarce, and as you will hopefully see, is the principles are very, very similar. No matter what you write, academic writing has some hallmarks, and what I'm trying to do now is to teach you the hallmarks and the basic structure and the basic principles to help you write really good research papers. So in my experience, there are three hurdles that you have to overcome for writing good papers. Hurdle number one is to create a convincing narrative. So think of your paper as a journey, and you write down, about your journey, the narrative, like a good novel. So it has a good beginning that's really, immersive and takes you in, and has a clear ending and in between some interesting bits. So you want people to enjoy reading your research paper, and you want it to be somewhat fulfilling, have all the right parts and stick logically together. So there needs to be a logical thread. And in the end, you want people to be convinced by your research. So that's probably the biggest challenge. Another challenge is to generate a critical mass. So in your paper, you want to present results, you want to present work that you've done. And that means before you can really write down the paper in full, you actually have to have done quite a substantial amount of work. So that's the power core of the paper, if you like. And you need that power core, you need that critical mass to give it that boom, to give it really the interesting results, the interesting evidence to support your results. And that usually requires a lot of work. And the last hurdle is shine like a diamond. So it's sometimes easy to underestimate how much time goes into revising and refining a paper. So for example, you usually create a first version, and usually you need at least again as much time to bring that first version to a really nice full version before you can really submit it as a really nice paper. So it takes a lot of time to revise it, and it's an iterative process. So you don't get there immediately, but you revise it and you revise it again. And sometimes the paper gets rejected, which is not the end of the world at all. It's just an opportunity to give it another round of revisions and to make it even better. And I can tell you from my own experience, sometimes, papers get rejected, and then suddenly they are really, really good papers, Just sometimes the little bit of extra is missing. So let's have a look at a typical structure of a paper. So here you've got 6 typical ingredients, and what exactly the structure of your paper is depends very much on what type of paper you're looking at. So it could be more a theoretical paper, it could be more an empirical paper with lots of studies and collected evidence. But this structure is something that is fairly generic. So you always start with an introduction, right? So you have to somehow introduce what you're doing to the reader. Then one of the first questions is always, what have other people done? Usually there's related work. And in science, we're always trying to do something novel. And the way to show that what we're doing is novel is to tell people what other people have already done and what they haven't done. And that's basically the purpose of related work. So you've got a related work section or chapter, and then very often if you're creating things, you would have something like a design section. So in the design section, you describe whatever you have created. Could be your own system, could be more a theoretical framework, could be anything. And whatever you have created, usually the question is always, how good is it? Is it worth using? And so whatever you do, you have to evaluate it somehow. And so an evaluation can take different shapes and forms. For example, if you are working theoretically, then an evaluation might be a series of proofs that you do. Theoretical proofs to really show that what you're doing is correct. Or, if it's more an empirical paper where you're exploring things, then the evaluation will probably be one of the main parts. And there it's a lot about how you do it, the methodology, the empirical methodology, the procedure, and then of course the results. And usually evaluations give us only bits of evidence. You can never evaluate everything, and you can never give full answers usually to your research questions. Only in theory, usually it's possible to, to give a completely clear-cut answer, either it's true or not. But very often, usually the research questions we are dealing with, they are not as clear-cut. So there's usually a bit of speculation involved, and that usually goes into a separate section. So that's why we have the discussion section to basically speculate and use our evaluation results as bits of evidence, like a detective, to build a full picture and present that, the most likely picture, to our audience. And finally, in the conclusion, you wrap it all up and you basically give people take-home messages. So if they read nothing else, at least, reading the conclusion should give them something useful to take home. Now, the convincing narrative basically goes through this whole structure from beginning to end. The critical mass, think of it like the power core of your paper. That's usually in the design and in evaluation. So this is where all the many hours of work are usually. So designing things and redesigning things and designing and running all these experiments and evaluating the data, etc. And then you have to polish the whole paper. So the diamond part, that's really looking at the whole thing and just going over and over and over again. And that's a really important part that deserves extra attention. Now, how about narratives? So how do you create this logical thread? Let's have a look at a little diagram. So in the introduction, the main aim is to say what you're doing, and what you are doing is usually reflected in your research questions. So many papers, they formulate research questions, or RQs for short, and they're really useful to make it crystal clear what you're really trying to achieve. And that's really useful also for yourself, because sometimes it's easy to forget what you're actually trying to achieve. And very often your research questions have to go through several iterations. And making them really clear, making it really clear what you're doing, what you're trying to achieve in the introduction, that is good for your readers, because it means they can orient themselves. This is the beginning of our journey. This is where we are going. And another function of the introduction is why. So you've got your interesting research questions. Why are they interesting? Are they novel? So we'll talk about that a little bit later. Then, when we go to the related work, it's again about your research questions. So this time you're asking, what are others doing? And you're not just arbitrarily summarizing things that other people are doing, but it's always using your own research questions as a lens. So basically you are asking, do others provide answers to my research questions? And how far are there already answers, or at least partial answers or hints out there? And that's the related work. And the key thing here is what not. What are others doing not? So this is basically defining the gap for your paper to fill. It's basically about finding your niche. And in the related work, by saying how other people answer your research questions, usually it also becomes clear what they're not doing. And that creates the space for your niche, for your paper, to convince people that this is really a useful contribution. After the related work comes design and evaluation, so the power core. And again, this is about our research questions. Yes, so what are we evaluating? Usually we are designing something and evaluating something to answer our research questions. So for example, a research question could be, how do we solve a particular problem? And the design would then be the design of a solution to solve that particular problem. And usually when you ask, how can we solve a problem? If it's a difficult problem, usually you can either create a bad solution or a good solution. So the next question is usually, how good is the solution? that you're developing. And so that's usually one of your research questions. And as you can see, also the design and the evaluation is very much about your research questions. So the research questions, they really help you to keep on track. And finally, in the discussion and conclusion, again, you're looking at your research questions, and here usually you're really trying to provide an answer. So what's the answer? And you're also talking about implications. So once you've come up with your most likely answer to your research questions, you ask, so what? So why is this important for others? What can they do with it? So for example, talking a bit about applications, about take-home messages that can be really useful for other people. And that closes the circle. So as you can see, it's a little bit like revolving around the sun, and the sun is your research questions. Yes, the whole universe is revolving around your research questions. And if you stick to that, then it will be much easier for you to keep a logical thread that doesn't diverge on tangents. That's a very, very common thing, that you're trying to do one thing in a paper, but then you're somehow diverging from it, and you're not really coming to conclusions that are really useful to your initial research questions. And so that's why very often you have to refine your research questions, like a little bit like a crosshair, and you really you've got your power core of what you are really doing, and you're usually identifying interesting bits in your power core, all the work that you've done, and you're honing in on that with your research questions to make it really clear what you're doing and to give people something useful, a nice focus with useful take-home messages in the end. So this is how you stick to a logical thread. It's harder than it sounds. And when you write it all down, there's one really useful method, which is called the funnel method. And when you think about a funnel has a wide end and a narrow end. And in the funnel method, it means that when you write things down, you start at a general level, at a more abstract level, providing context, providing overview, and only after you've basically established the full picture, the big picture, then you hone in and you provide details. You become more specific, you focus, and you provide all the specific details about what you're doing. And this is basically about how our brain works. Yes, so when you, even if you think about a visual picture, if you just see a small fragment, a detail fragment of a picture, can be really difficult to understand. But if you look at an overview first, that's much easier, right? So our brains, they work much better if we can put things into context. And the funnel method helps our readers to put everything, even the intricate details that are part of the meat of the core of our paper, to put them into context, and that makes it a lot easier to understand them. So whenever possible, use the funnel method. Now let's have a look at a typical structure. Let's start with the introduction. So the introduction is usually around 1 or 2 pages long. And now let's have a look at some typical paragraphs that you would put into your introduction. So again, we're using the funnel method, and what we're doing is in the introduction where we want to really tell people what you're doing, right? And a good way of doing this is to start with context, with a big picture, to basically help people to understand roughly what you're doing and to help them link it up with their general knowledge they already have. And then we narrow it down to research questions. And the research questions, they are really the focus. They really clearly define what you're really doing. So the first one, basically what your research questions are, think of them as puzzle pieces, okay? So when you think about the carpet of knowledge, the big field of knowledge, everybody's contributing things in science, and there are lots of uncovered bits, right? There are lots of things that we don't know. And your paper, your research questions is like a little puzzle piece that you fit into a place which hasn't properly been covered yet. And usually there will be puzzle pieces around it, but for your paper to be focused, it's really good to really define the outline, the boundaries of your little puzzle piece of your research questions. That makes it really easier for your readers to understand what you're doing, and much easier for yourself to write it down in the first place. Now, how could we start? Paragraph 1. So I'm doing a lot of work in exergaming, exercise gaming. So let's just look at that as an example. So for example, in an exercise gaming paper, the context would often be physical inactivity. So that would be the general problem that many people are trying to address. And that's also something that many people know about, right? Physical inactivity, that it's a problem. So having that in the first paragraph as a context would be really good for readers to get into your paper and then, to learn more about the details that you're trying to convey. So paragraph 2, so we're going now further down the funnel. It's getting narrower and narrower, and we are making it more and more specific. So paragraph 2 could be the specific research problem that you're looking at. So when we can't easily solve the overall problem of physical inactivity, right? The general problem. So usually what we do is we solve very specific problems. So for example, a very specific problem might be to look at a particular approach to motivate people to exercise particularly hard, for example. Yes. So how can we help them to exercise particularly hard using exergames, for example? And then at the tip of the funnel come your research questions. So paragraph 3 could be describing very briefly the specific ideas that you've got. So for example, using specific game design to help people to exercise really hard. And then you have a list of research questions. So, and for example, so usually you don't have a lot of research questions, usually, between 2 and 5. And the research question could be more about the design, how do you solve something, but it could also be an empirical paper, for example, what is the effect of something on something else? And understanding how things affect each other, that could be really useful for others, or how you can affect things using particular approaches, new design approaches, new solutions. And another typical question is, how well does it work, your proposed solution? So you've got your research questions, and now you still need to convince your readers that what you're doing is really important. So you're doing that already implicitly. For example, in paragraph 1, the general problem, ideally you would somehow make clear that the general problem is important, that a specific problem in paragraph 2 is somehow important, but usually what I do is I have a separate paragraph where I make it really clear that these are important research questions. We really want to know the answer. And the prime argument for this, for the motivation in science, is usually, first of all, novelty. So you want to make it really, really clear that what you are doing is new. Nobody else has done that before. And if you see lots of similar works, don't despair. That's completely normal. So it's actually good to find similar works. So those are the adjacent puzzle pieces. So what you would write into your novelty paragraph is usually something like, others did X, Y, and Z, but not X. So others did this and this and this. But what you're exactly doing, that's something people haven't done, or not completely done, or not well enough. And then it's also useful to mention some applications and wider benefits of what you're doing. So for example, if there's any additional problems it could help with, or any specific applications, practical applications, that's really useful to mention right at the beginning in the introduction. So your readers continue reading the paper being fully convinced that what you're doing is great and it's really useful. Usually I add another paragraph about contributions. And so you've probably heard about the context of the concept of minimum publishable unit. So it's a bit sarcastic. So some people, they say, oh yeah, you do your research and then you chop it into bits and you make the bits as small as possible so that you can just publish them as papers. So minimum publishable units, so that you get as many papers as possible from your work. But personally, I really believe that's the wrong approach. It's much better to have really a few but really strong publications. So personally, I would recommend to you try to make it a maximum publishable unit. So look at your research questions and do it really properly. Make it really thorough, and then say exactly what you're contributing. So for example, in a numbered list, you're contributing this and this and this guidelines, maybe 2 or 3 things or 4 things that you're contributing, and having a really nice publication that's strong and, if possible, in a good peer-reviewed venue. That's usually, in my opinion, much better than having lots of piecemeal applications. Usually they get not noticed as much as when you are really trying to go for something that's really, strong, and you really try to put a lot into it. It's also much more satisfying doing the maximum publishable unit rather than trying to salami chop your minimum publishable units. So that's the introduction. Let's have a look at related work and also limits of related work, which is really important. So again, we use the funnel. And how do we apply the funnel to related work? Well, what I recommend you do is you start with the least related works, so the things that are more peripheral to what you're doing, and then you hone into the most related works, so the works that are really, really close to what you're doing. So when you think again about the tapestry of knowledge, then you've got the adjacent puzzle pieces, and they're all different areas of related work or even individual related works. And somewhere you fit in there, yes? And now it's based, while the introduction is more about your puzzle piece, defining what your puzzle piece is, the related work is more defining the landscape around your puzzle piece. And the first step is basically identifying the areas of related work that are somehow related to your research questions. So usually there's not just one area of related work, but usually there are, let's say, 2 or 3 bigger areas that are related. And it's good to cover all of these areas. So what I usually do is I have subsections, one subsection for each of these areas. So for example, in exergaming, you're looking at exercise motivation, you're looking at VR exergames. Maybe there's also a bit about VR design in general in there, or game design. Those could be subsections, and you order them from least related to most related. And the last subsection is where, the really close works are in. And also in each subsection, you usually start general. You start with an overview of each area, providing the big picture, and then you drill down into the details. And in particular, you discuss the related works in light of your research questions. So remember, it's all about the research questions. What do they do? What kind of answers or clues do they provide, the related works, and what don't they do? And that's equally important to say what they do not do, because that shows really where you come in, where your gap is for your puzzle piece. And of course, the most detail is on the most related works. So related work is infinite, right? So you can spend your whole life just using Google Scholar and finding more and more related works. So when you do your related work search, it's always good to start with the most related works, even though you start writing up with a big picture first. But you should at least have the dozen most related works covered, and then the slightly less related works. So this is usually a good way to do a related work search. And then you kind of fill your funnel up from the bottom, and then you include also some more peripheral papers. In general, cite as much as you can. So citations are good, showing that you know the landscape, the field of what other people have already done is a good thing. But the most related works, those are the most important. So they are crucial that you don't miss those. Let's have a look at your power core, at the design and design space. So this is usually the heart of the paper. This is usually what takes up the most space. And by the way, so this is the page numbers that I list at the top of the slides. They are for a 10-page paper, so typical length, good conference or sometimes also journal paper, and not including citation, not including bibliography, but that scales. Yes, you can say, you know, let's say if you've got 100-page thesis, then, you know, this would be between 10 and 50 pages here, the design and the design space, depending on what kind of project you're working on. And so when you're talking about your own designs, it's really important to illustrate what you're doing. So illustrations are really powerful. And personally, I'm a big fan of teaser figures in papers. So you've probably seen that before, that you look at a research paper, and the first thing that you're looking at on page 1, right after the title and author list, is a nice picture illustrating what the paper is actually about. And that's incredibly useful, because just looking at that picture, people can already understand what's going on. And very often a picture does convey 1,000 words. You know, seeing that is much more effective for them to then reading through bits of your paper and together with the caption of the teaser. And that's really powerful also to catch people's attention and to get noticed. So I really recommend that. And also in general, when you're describing your design, it's always good, again, to use the funnel. And at the tip of the funnel, what I usually like to do is create a nice design overview, a nice graphic, a nice picture, which really shows people what you're doing somehow. And again, that helps people really nicely to understand the big picture first before you get lost in all the design details, which are of course also important for your paper, but are really subordinate to the overall overview of the paper. So you start with the overall idea, and then you break your design down into parts. Usually there are different parts to a solution or to something that you're doing, and breaking it down in a nice logical manner, and then maybe breaking it down again. That makes it really easy for people to navigate your paper and to understand what's going on. So you always justify your design. So why is it designed that way? Why is it not designed? Why is it designed not designed in a different way? And your design decisions, it's always good to justify them with related work. So usually, you know, there are other designs that other people have already created, other things that people have created, and to relate what you're doing to what they are doing is a really good thing. Do that at every possible opportunity, you know, the similarities and the differences. It's kind of comforting for people to see, oh yes, you're really, you know, becoming part of that wider tapestry of what other people are doing, the wider community. You know, it's about all the links between what all people are doing, and that they're actually noticing each other and considering what each other are doing. So there's really progress. It conveys that sense of progress. So the more you can do that, the better it is. Now, so let's say you've created something really nice, and don't forget to evaluate it. People always want to know, how good is it actually, right? And that's usually part of your research questions. And the first thing that you usually do here is talking about the methodology. So how are you evaluating your solution? And so usually you start with the study design, the methods, the variables. Again, it's a funnel here. Yeah, so the study design is more the big picture overall. What methods are you using? What are the independent variables in case you're using that kind of quantitative methodology? And then you're going to the detailed procedure, you know, which is really down to the details, step by step, how you're doing it. And the key here is that it should be reproducible. So you should provide enough details for others to do the same and ideally come to the same results and then the same conclusions. That's so important for science. And if that's not the case, many people criticize it. Unfortunately, there's a lot of research out there which is not reproducible, and it causes a lot of problems in general for science. And usually, if you make it reproducible, even maybe you even publish some of your data and, you know, some of your questionnaires together with your paper, people usually really appreciate it. They really do. Also, reviewers, they really appreciate that, and it because they feel that you're really contributing to science, you're really helping others, and it makes it easier for overall scientific progress to happen, rather than, you know, trying to shut everything off and not share it. So now, after the methodology, have a separate section for the results. And so you've done all your, if you've conducted your methodology, gone through your procedure, collected all the data, and the results is presenting that data. So what does the situation actually look like? And this is really about illustrating the facts that you have found. So results are really about facts. So you've got tables are really good. I usually, if I have quantitative data in a paper, I always put in a table giving a nice summary of different conditions, the most important variables. Charts illustrating the most important results. So clear charts are really important. And as you can see in this example, I usually have also error bars. So usually, you know, confidence intervals so people can see how basically how reliable my results actually are. And if you've got quantitative results, always do statistical testing and report it in a professional style, that it's easy again for others to take in, to validate, to reproduce. So I recommend APA style. If you Google reporting statistics in APA style, you will find exactly how to do it. And sometimes you also have qualitative data, of course, and usually my recommendation is if you can do both, it's always good, yes? So if you've got quantitative data, if you're working empirically, if you've got quantitative data, that's great. And it's always usually good to have a bit of qualitative data, like participant comments as well, because that usually provides a more rounded picture of what's going on. And that also goes into results. So you could, for example, do a small thematic analysis where you group different themes of what your participants have told you together and briefly report them with some examples. Now, after the results, you've got the discussion. And what are you doing in the discussion? There are a few things. So you're slowly now wrapping up your paper. And the first thing that you want to do in your discussion is answer your research questions. So very often it's hard to provide exact answers for research questions. Often it's impossible. So what people expect here is don't just repeat your results. Think of your results as small clues, yes? So it's a little bit, think of yourself as in a courtroom. It's a crime story, yes? And you're trying to make your case in a courtroom. Oh, this person, he committed the crime, yes? So you're Sherlock Holmes and you've gathered all these clues while doing your evaluation. And now the discussion is basically putting the clues together into a concise and convincing argument. So we believe that you know, you can motivate people using this method because we've got these and these clues pointing it out. So you're trying to answer the overall research question, backing up your arguments with your little clues, with your evidence, with your results. And usually people expect you also to compare your results with results of other people, of other researchers. So again, in the discussion, your answer to the research question, put it into context, put it into the context of all the things that other people have already found out in that area. How does it fit? Is there a contradiction? Is it somehow surprisingly new, or does it confirm existing results? All this is useful information, so put it into the discussion. And always try to lift your discussion from a purely descriptive level where you're just repeating results to a more interpretative level where you're really trying to basically, you know, create a message that goes beyond of your small numbers that you gathered in the results section. Yes, people want to really have something, a nice answer to the research question that, you know, is a bit more palatable than just repeating lots of numbers and lots of small details. You know, try to create something nice, a nice message from it, a nice answer that's somehow also memorable. So another thing that you do in the discussion is talk about limitations. So you're of course always trying to portray yourself in a good light, right? When you're writing the paper, but there's always something that's not quite right, always. No research is perfect, yes? And trying to pretend that everything is just great and everything is super clear is just unrealistic. People won't buy it. Yes, it's much better to be honest and to say, okay, so there are some limitations in what we're doing. So for example, study limitations, So maybe, you know, some of the measurements are not as reliable as we would like them to, you know, maybe some measurements are missing, or maybe there were some malfunctions during the experiment. So all these things, you list them, but you take an optimistic perspective, right? So you've done it, and usually what you've tried to somehow correct it or do something about it, or you believe that it doesn't spoil everything that you've done, right? So you've taken care of that. So it's like the full glass and the empty glass, you know. Okay, the glass is not completely full, yeah, but it's half full, yes. So that's the kind of attitude you want to bring to the limitations. So you go through your limitations. You know, it could be the study limitations of how you've collected your data, how you've conducted your evaluation, or also design limitations about your solution. You know, that maybe your solution doesn't solve everything. Maybe there's some corner cases or some things where it fails, and that's fine. You know, you just say that's how it is, but it's still useful. You know, yes, my study has limitations, but you know, there are some missing data, but you know, only a little bit. You know, we still got enough data to make solid conclusions and use our statistical tests. Yes, you know, sometimes the system crashed during our study, but we managed to, in those, you know, it didn't happen very often, and we managed to immediately restart it or repeat that condition, and it's, you know, hence we could still collect the data, and the data looked fine, you know, it didn't look like an outlier. So those are the kinds of things you want to write. And last but not least, you want to talk about the impact that your research has. So it's the so what. So now you've got nice answers to your research question, nice insights based on your results. And now the question is, what can people do with it? How can this be useful? So ideally, you want to talk about how your answers, how your main conclusions can be useful for other people. For example, for other researchers or also for practitioners. So how can they use it? Describing applications, also simply describing why it's widely applicable, maybe providing some guidelines that arise from your paper, not just for researchers, but maybe also from for practitioners. For example, I don't know, for example, in exergaming, it could be maybe some exergame designers as opposed to exergame researchers, or maybe even people, or maybe even trainers, or you know, other sports and exercise people. And also real world consequences. So, you know, what are the consequences of your research? How could it be used to change the world in some way? And what would this little change that you can affect with your paper be? If you can think about it a little bit, you can often see there are actually interesting impacts that you can generate. And that's good for people to see that. That's usually appreciated if you analyze this. So it's not just a sales pitch, the impact, it's more like an analysis where you, again, with related work, really break it down, how impact can be generated. And finally, the last challenge, shine like a diamond. And the main advice from me is go the extra mile. Writing papers, doing science is a lot of work. It just is. It's sometimes, you know, very frustrating for everyone, but it can also be extremely satisfying and very rewarding. And when you go the extra mile and you feel that your research is really getting somewhere, you know, and it's really improving and people are starting to appreciate it, that's a really, really nice feeling. And I wish for you all to have that. But sometimes we have to go through this frustration period and we have to work through it for that to happen. So, you know, to get there, very often you have to cite and discuss those extra papers. You know, you thought you were just done with your lit review, and then your supervisor, somebody else, comes with another stack of papers, and you think, oh my God, not again. But trust me, it's worth it, and it will, in the end, it will really make it better what you're doing, and you will feel that it's really getting better, and that will really give you satisfaction. Do that extra analysis. Sometimes you think, oh, I've done all these statistical tests. I'm sick of doing statistical tests. Get me out of here. And then, oh no, there's this other way to analyze it, but you have to kind of prepare the data for it, and it'll take, I don't know, a whole day or a whole week to do it. Sometimes, it's really worth doing it. Yes. So go the extra mile, do that extra analysis, and there, you will be rewarded for it. Check those numbers one more time. You've gone through your numbers already 3 times, but still something doesn't look right. It's very easy to make small mistakes in papers. Most papers have small mistakes, even those that are published. So it's really worth checking it over. And sometimes it comes across a little bit as OCD, but before the paper really gets published, trust me, it is really a good idea to double and triple check things, because mistakes simply do happen. Revise, improve, edit that section again and again. You may have had that feeling that you've written something and your supervisor comes back with feedback, or your colleague, and you change it again, and then people have a look at it again, and you get more feedback, and just feels like an ongoing thing, and again. But trust me, it is worth it, and your paper is getting better. You will get lots of criticism, and sometimes the criticism can be really demotivating. Yes, sometimes some people can be a bit harsh, which is really not nice, and it also really shouldn't be like that. And don't take it too hard. It's every bit of criticism is actually good. Usually criticism doesn't look like something. When first you get it, it hits you like a hammer, right? It can be a bit of a shock. But criticism can be incredibly useful for you, yes? And thinking about it just on a rational, level, don't make it personal. Don't take it personal. It's always just about the paper, and thinking about it can really make you a better researcher and really push you forward. Redo and reformat those figures again and again. Figures are tricky. There's so many things that you can do to improve how your figures look, to make them more appealing, to make them more easier to take in. And it's so important, because people usually look at figures first, yes? And if you make them really clear and kind of speak for themselves, that's worth so much. So it's really, again, worth going the extra mile. And don't stop until it looks really good. Sometimes it's like the mouse that's testing mouse traps with a helmet. Sometimes it feels like that. But again, trust me, go the extra mile, and in the end, you will get that feeling of satisfaction. So now, thank you very much for letting me talk so long and being patient enough to listen. And I'm very happy for you now to give me questions that I'll try to answer.